On the morning of October 5th, 1789, a woman in the fish markets of Paris picks up a drum and starts to beat it. Within hours, she will be walking 12 miles through the rain at the head of 7,000 armed women, and by nightfall, they will have surrounded the Palace of Versailles, murdered 2 guards, mounted their heads on pikes, and dragged the King of France back to the capital as a prisoner. They did not march for liberty. They did not march for a constitution. They marched because there was no bread. 7,000 women, 7,000. And the thing they wanted, the thing they were willing to kill and die for, was a soft brown loaf that you can buy today for less than the change in your pocket. You have eaten it your whole life. It sits on your counter in a plastic bag right now, so cheap and so constant that you throw the stale end away without a thought. But this ordinary thing, this loaf you barely notice, has decided who ruled and who starved, who was buried like a god, and who was worked to death in the dark. It has been money. It has been medicine. It has been a weapon of empire and the trigger of revolution. But the story of bread does not start in the streets of Paris. It starts more than 14,000 years before that hungry morning, on the cold floor of a stone hut in a desert that no longer exists, where someone we will never know did something no human had ever done before. In the black desert of northeastern Jordan, archaeologists found the remains of a fireplace. Inside it, burned into the ground and preserved for 144 centuries, were tiny charred crumbs. When they looked at them under a microscope, they saw the unmistakable structure of bread. Ground grain, mixed with water, flattened, and baked on hot stone. 14,400 years old. Sit with that number for a moment. This bread was baked more than 4,000 years before humans invented farming. Before we planted a single deliberate seed, before we tamed a single animal, before the first village, before the wheel, before writing, before metal, we were making bread. The people who baked it were hunter-gatherers. They gathered wild grasses, wild einkorn, and wild barley. And they did this impossibly patient thing. They stripped the seeds. They ground them between stones until their arms ached. They carried water. And they baked a flatbread on a fire. This changes the entire story we tell about ourselves. For a century, we believed the sequence went like this. Humans learned to farm, farming gave us surplus grain, and surplus grain gave us bread. But the crumbs in the Jordanian fireplace are older than farming, which means it may be the other way around. It may be that we loved bread so much, this warm and portable and comforting thing, that we settled down and became farmers just to have more of it. That we did not invent bread because we farmed. We invented farming because we could not stop making bread. Think about what that means. Every city you have ever walked through, every field, every fence, every border on every map, all of it may trace back to a craving for a loaf. The clock of civilization had already started ticking. It just needed something to eat. Now here's the reversal, the thing that turns your assumptions inside out. We think of bread as the safest, blandest, most harmless food on earth. The thing you give a sick child. The thing that means comfort and home. But for most of its history, bread was dangerous. Bread could kill you, and it killed in ways that looked like the work of demons. The problem was a fungus. A dark purple growth called ergot that infects rye, the grain that fed the poor of medieval Europe when wheat was too expensive. Ergot survives grinding. It survives baking. And when you eat it, it attacks your blood and your brain. Your fingers and toes turn black and rot away while you are still alive. A slow gangrene that felt like being burned in a fire that no one could see. People called it St. Anthony's fire. Others went mad, convulsing, hallucinating, seeing things crawling on the walls, gripped by a terror that had no source. Whole villages went insane at harvest time. In the year 944, in one region of France, ergot poisoning is said to have killed as many as 20,000 people. 20,000! From bread, and nobody understood why. They did not have the word for fungal alkaloids. They did not have microscopes, but they knew, in their bones, that the daily loaf could betray them. Some historians now believe that ergot poisoned rye may have been behind the strange convulsions and visions that helped fuel the witch trials in Europe and later in colonial Salem, where teenage girls twisted on the floor and screamed of invisible torment. The staff of life, hiding a hallucinogen. The everyday loaf, whispering madness into a whole community. So understand where we are. Bread was not always comfort. Bread was a gamble you made 3 times a day, and most people had no choice but to make it. And yet, long before the horrors of the medieval rye fields, other people had already tamed this dangerous grain and turned it into something close to miraculous. To find them, we go to the banks of the Nile. The ancient Egyptians were, by any honest measure, the greatest bread bakers the world had ever seen. They had more than 40 words for different kinds of bread. 40! They baked it in dozens of shapes, some flavored with honey and dates, some studded with seeds, some pressed into molds shaped like animals and human figures. Bread was so central to their world that it became money itself. A worker on the pyramids was paid in bread and beer, wages, an entire economy measured in loaves. But the Egyptians did something no one before them had truly mastered. They discovered how to make bread rise. Somewhere, someone left a mixture of flour and water sitting out too long, and wild yeast from the air drifted down and began to feed on it. And the dough bubbled and swelled and came alive. And instead of throwing it away, this unnamed baker put it in the oven anyway and pulled out something light, airy, soft, transformed. They did not have the word for fermentation. They did not know that microscopic organisms were breathing out gas inside their dough, giving off carbon dioxide, leavening the loaf from within. They could not have known, but they were cultivating a living civilization of yeast with their bare hands, keeping a piece of yesterday's dough to start tomorrow's, passing living cultures from household to household, generation to generation. That is a staggering achievement. These people, working thousands of years before anyone knew microbes existed, had domesticated an invisible organism and put it to work. They were biotechnologists. They just called themselves bakers. And the bread built the bodies that built the pyramids. When we examine the mummified remains of ancient Egyptians, we find their teeth worn down almost to the gums, ground flat and full of tiny fractures. Not from age, from bread. The grinding stones they used shed fine grit and sand into the flour, and over a lifetime that grit filed their teeth to stumps. The very thing that kept them alive was slowly sanding them away from the inside of their own mouths. That is the deal bread has always offered. It gives and it takes in the same bite. The Egyptians passed their leavening to the Greeks, who turned baking into an art, and the Greeks passed it to the Romans, who turned it into an industry. Rome understood something that every ruler after would learn and relearn in blood. Whoever controls the bread controls the people. In Rome, at the height of the empire, the state handed out free grain, and later, free baked bread, to hundreds of thousands of citizens. It was called the grain dole. It was not charity, it was control. A poet of the age sneered that the Roman public, who had once given away military command and every high office, now longed for only 2 things: bread and circuses. Panem et circenses. Keep their bellies full and their eyes entertained, and they will not notice that you have taken their freedom. That phrase is 2,000 years old, and you could paste it over half the world today and it would still fit. Rome built entire fleets whose only job was to carry grain across the Mediterranean from Egypt and North Africa. If those ships were late, if a storm sank the harvest convoy, the city rioted. Emperors rose and fell on the reliability of the bread supply. The most powerful state the ancient world had ever seen was, at its foundation, a machine for moving flour. A handful of grain, multiplied across an empire, decided whether an emperor kept his throne or lost his head. And that is the pattern that will repeat, again and again, all the way to Versailles. The clock was already ticking. The kings just couldn't hear it yet, because there was another divide hiding inside the loaf, and it was the oldest class war in human history. The color of your bread told the world exactly who you were. White bread, made from finely sifted wheat flour with all the bran and germ removed, was the food of the rich. It was pale, soft, delicate, and hugely labor-intensive to produce, because sifting flour that finely by hand took enormous effort. To eat white bread was to announce that you did not work, that others sifted your flour for you, that you were clean and refined and elevated above the dirt. The very word we still use, refined, means both purified flour and a certain kind of person. Dark bread, coarse and heavy, full of bran, sometimes stretched with beans or acorns or sawdust in the worst years, was the food of the peasant. Black bread, coarse bread, the bread of those who labored in the fields that grew the grain but never got to taste the good part of it. There is a bitter irony there, so sharp it should stop you cold. The people who broke their bodies growing the wheat ate the worst of it, while the people who never touched the soil ate the softest, whitest, finest crumb. The loaf was a ladder, and everyone knew exactly which rung they stood on. You could read a person's entire station in life by the color of the bread on their table. And for the millions on the bottom rung, that daily dark loaf was not a side dish. It was nearly the whole meal. In 18th century France, a working family might spend half of everything they earned on bread. Half. Half their income. To eat. So imagine what happens to such a family when the price of bread doubles. This decision, the decision to build a whole civilization on a single fragile loaf, seemed reasonable at the time. It was not. Because bread does not just feed people. When it fails, it kills them by the millions, and it chooses its victims. Now we come to the part of the story that should make you angry. Let us go to Ireland, to a small stone cottage in the west of the country in the autumn of 1846. A mother walks out to her small plot of land in the morning, and the smell reaches her before she sees anything. A sweet, sickening stench of rot hanging over the whole valley. She kneels and pulls at the ground, and the potatoes come up black and liquid, dissolving in her hands into a foul slime. Her family's entire food supply for the coming year, gone in a matter of days, turned to poison in the soil. Now you might ask, what potatoes have to do with bread? Everything. Because in those same years and for years after, Ireland was growing grain. Fields and fields of wheat and oats and barley, golden and healthy and untouched by the blight. Enough to feed the starving population many times over. And while that mother's children swelled and weakened and died of hunger, that grain was being loaded onto ships, under armed guard, and sailed out of the country to be sold in England, to be turned into bread for people who were not starving at all. The blight was nature. The starvation was policy. Ireland did not run out of food. Ireland ran out of the food the poor were allowed to eat, while the good grain, the bread grain, sailed away over the horizon in front of their eyes. More than 1 million people died. Another 1 million or more fled, packed into vessels so deadly they were called coffin ships. The population of an entire nation fell by a quarter. And through the worst of it, the wheat kept moving toward the sea, past the hollow faces of the people who had grown it. And here is where we name the man with the paper trail. His name was Charles Trevelyan, the British civil servant placed in charge of famine relief. He was not a monster in a story. He was a real official who put his beliefs in writing, in official correspondence, not in private letters he thought no one would read. He called the famine a mechanism for reducing surplus population. He wrote that the real evil was not the hunger, but the moral evil of the selfish, perverse, and turbulent character of the people. He believed the starvation was, in his words, a direct stroke of an all-wise and all-merciful providence, a judgment sent by God to teach the Irish a lesson. And he moved to shut down the relief efforts, arguing that feeding people would only make them dependent. He wrote those words about a nation of dying children, and he signed his name to them. That is not the cruelty of nature. That is the cruelty of a man behind a desk, deciding that a starving people deserved their fate, while the bread grains sailed away. This is their story. It belongs to the Irish, and to the millions of their descendants scattered across America and the world, and no one gets to soften it for them. Now hold that image, because we are going back to France, to the hungry morning we began with, and now you will understand exactly why those women marched. By the summer of 1789, the ordinary French family was spending as much as 90% of its income on bread. 90%. A brutal winter had wrecked the harvest. A single bad hailstorm had flattened crops across the country. The price of a 4-pound loaf, the daily loaf that kept a family alive, had climbed to a full day's wages for a laborer. Imagine working an entire day, dawn to dark, and earning exactly 1 loaf of bread. And then imagine having a family to feed with it. The people were not starving because there was no bread. They were starving because they could not afford the bread that existed. While at Versailles, The court ate white loaves and cake and lived in a world of gold and mirrors that most of them had never seen. The rumor that spread through the markets, the rumor that lit the fuse, was about bread. And when the women of Paris finally rose on that October morning, they did not go to the treasury. They went to the palace. They wanted the king himself, because in the ancient logic of Rome and every ruler since, the king was supposed to be the guarantor of bread. They even had a mocking name for the royal family they dragged back to Paris. They called them the baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's little boy, as if the king's one job, his whole reason to exist, was to make sure his people were fed. And he had failed. That queen, Marie Antoinette, is remembered for a single sentence about bread. Told that the peasants had no bread, she supposedly said, "Let them eat cake." She almost certainly never said it. The story was already old before she was even born, attached to other royals long dead. But it stuck to her, and it helped carry her to the guillotine, because it captured a truth, even if the words were invented. It captured the unbridgeable distance between the people who ate white bread and the people who died for the lack of dark. Both the king and the queen would lose their heads. And underneath the grand ideas of the revolution, underneath liberty and equality and the rights of man, there was always, always, the simple fact of the loaf. A handful of grain priced out of reach, and 1,000 years of monarchy came crashing down. Think about that for a second. The most famous revolution in human history, the one that gave us the modern political words for left and right, was, at its beating heart, a riot about the price of bread. But not every hero in the story of bread carried a pike. Some of them fought for it in ways so strange you will not believe they were real. Meet Antoine-Augustin Parmentier, a French pharmacist and one of the most gloriously obsessive men who ever lived. As a young soldier, he had been captured by the Prussians and fed almost nothing but potatoes. And instead of dying, as the French believed you would if you ate them, he thrived. At the time, the French were convinced the potato was dangerous, fit only for pigs, that it caused leprosy, that it was practically poison. Some regions had actually banned growing it, and Parmentier came home a fanatic, a man with a single mission burning inside him. He would make France eat the potato and break the country's deadly dependence on the single, failing loaf. But he did not lecture. He was far too clever for that. He staged spectacular dinners where every dish from soup to dessert was secretly made from potatoes. And he invited the most famous men in France, including Benjamin Franklin, to marvel at them. He presented a bouquet of purple potato flowers to the king and queen, and Marie Antoinette wore them in her hair, and suddenly the potato was fashionable at court. And then came his masterstroke, one of the great stunts in the history of food. He planted a large field of potatoes outside Paris, and he posted armed royal guards around it during the day, guarding it as if it were the most precious treasure in the kingdom. The message to the local peasants was irresistible. If it is guarded like gold, it must be worth stealing. And Parmentier, the sly genius, deliberately told his guards to accept bribes and to go home at night, leaving the field wide open. Under the cover of darkness, the peasants crept in and stole his potatoes and planted them in their own gardens, which is precisely what he had wanted all along. He tricked a nation into feeding itself. He gave France a second food, a backup, a defense against the failure of the loaf. And when he died, they planted potatoes on his grave, where they reportedly grow to this day. So the world learned, slowly and at a terrible cost, not to stake everything on a single crop, a single loaf, a single fragile thing. And then, in the 20th century, bread went somewhere no bread had ever gone before. And the story turns from tragedy to something close to wonder, because the loaf you eat today is stranger than anything in its bloody past. Consider that in 1928, an American named Otto Rohwedder unveiled a machine that did something no baker in 14,000 years had bothered to do at scale. It sliced the loaf before selling it. People thought it was absurd, a gimmick. Within 2 years, sliced bread outsold unsliced. It became so beloved, so instantly essential, that when the United States government briefly banned pre-sliced bread during the Second World War to save resources, there was such public outrage that they reversed the ban in less than 2 months. A nation that had lived without sliced bread for its entire existence could not endure 2 months of it. That is where the phrase comes from. the highest praise we give to any invention. The greatest thing since sliced bread. Consider that the fluffy, uniform, endlessly soft white loaf that finally put white bread on every table, rich and poor alike, ending that ancient class divide forever, did so by stripping out nearly everything nutritious. Manufacturers ground away the bran and the germ, the very parts that keep you healthy, to get that pure white crumb. And in doing so, they caused outbreaks of deficiency diseases. So governments passed laws forcing bakers to spray vitamins and iron back into the bread they had just stripped bare. The bread on your shelf right now is very likely enriched by law, injected with the nutrients that were milled out of it, because we finally gave everyone the white bread of kings and discovered it was quietly making them sick. Consider that the wheat itself, the plant, was rebuilt by human hands in the 20th century. A quiet, stubborn agronomist named Norman Borlaug spent years crossing thousands of wheat strains in the fields of Mexico, breeding a short, strong, disease-resistant, ferociously productive plant. When his new wheat spread across India and Pakistan and beyond in the 1960s, harvests doubled and then doubled again. He is credited, by serious historians, with saving as many as 1 billion lives from famine. 1 billion. One man and a better strain of wheat, standing between 1 billion human beings and starvation. You have probably never heard his name. He grew the bread that fed a world that never learned to thank him. And consider this, bread has left the planet. Astronauts on early space missions were actually banned from bringing ordinary bread aboard because a single floating crumb could drift into an instrument or a crew member's lungs in zero gravity and cause a catastrophe. The most ancient food we have, the food older than farming, older than the wheel, had to be left behind at the edge of the sky. Too dangerous for the future. They eat tortillas up there instead. Flatbread. The exact same thing those hunter-gatherers baked on hot stone in the Black Desert 14,000 years ago. Come full circle. The only bread clean enough for outer space. So let us go back one last time to that woman in the fish markets of Paris, picking up her drum on that cold October morning. She could not read. She would never see a map of the world she was about to change. She did not know that the loaf she was marching for was older than the pyramids, that it had rotted the teeth of the people who built them, that it had been money in Egypt and control in Rome, that it had driven her ancestors mad with a purple fungus and would starve 1 million Irish within her grandchildren's lifetime. She did not know she was standing at the end of a 14,000-year chain, holding one link of it in her hungry hands. She only knew that her children needed to eat, and that the loaf that should have fed them had been priced beyond her reach by men who ate cake. And with that, with nothing more than the price of bread, she and 7,000 women like her reached up and pulled a king off his throne. That is the thing about bread. It is the most ordinary object in your entire life. It is so cheap, so constant, so forgettable, that you let it go stale and throw it away without a flicker of thought. But every loaf you have ever held is the same loaf those women marched for, the same loaf that filed down the teeth of pyramid builders, the same loaf that sailed out of a starving Ireland under armed guard, the same loaf that a pharmacist tricked the nation into eating, the same loaf too dangerous for space. It built our cities. It fed our empires. It buried our dead and it overthrew our kings. You will never look at a loaf of bread the same way again. So before you go, tell me in the comments which one stopped you cold. Parmentier posting armed guards on a field of potatoes just so peasants would steal them. The grain ships sailing out of a starving Ireland while 1 million people died. Or the fact that ordinary bread is banned in space because a single crumb could kill an astronaut. Pick one and tell me why. And if this changed the way you see the thing on your kitchen counter, stay with us, because the next ordinary object hides a story just as dark.